Hey folks, and welcome to Typology, the show on which we explore the story of you through the lens of the Enneagram. My name is Anthony Skinner, producer of the show. We're thrilled to have you here with us today. We've got another exciting episode with author and Enneagram expert AJ Sherrill. AJ has authored several books. His latest is Being with God. He's also written Enneagram for Spiritual Formation. He is a professor at Fuller Theological Seminary. He knows his Enneagram really, really well, folks, so this is a real treat for all of us. He's a self-pres 3-wing 4, by the way. We're happy to have him on the show. Hey, before I move on, I want to remind you again that Ian dropped his book on December 28, about a month ago now, and we're getting great responses from people who have already read the book. I want to remind you that you can get that book anywhere fine books are sold, and the audio version is available as well. Hey, that's it for me, Anthony Skinner. Really glad you're here, folks. And now, here is the host of our show, Ian Crum.
My friend, AJ Sherrill, Enneagram 3 with a 4-wing, author, friend. Welcome to Typology.
So good to see you both.
It's great to see you.
Yeah, good to be with you, man.
All right, let's just jump right in, my friend. You are an Enneagram expert, workshop teacher, guide. You've got books on the Enneagram. I want to start by just simply asking you to share a little bit about your history with it before we jump into more specifics.
Yeah, I first learned the theory from Father Richard Rohr. This would have been back around 2010. I was doing my doctorate program, and Richard had invited a few of us out to his home to just kind of go through what is now called the learning school. And he sort of we got him off task talking about the Enneagram. And we managed to get him off task for about half a day. It was hilarious. And so he just riffed on this, and I just drank it up as a pastor, now priest. It was like, oh my goodness, this is sort of naming things that have been patterns. It's organizing ideas in language that's just giving me all sorts of clarity about why I do what I do, and what I don't know. And then from there, actually, we probably have talked about this, Ian, at some point, but you invited me and a few other pastors when I was pastoring in New York City out to Greenwich, where you were hosting a workshop with Suzanne Stabile. This was before the road back to you. And so I had the privilege of going out and spending a day with y'all. And I came up to Suzanne at a break, and I was like, hey, who's doing stuff on spiritual rhythms and formation using the Enneagram, specifically rooted in the church, for the church? And she was like, I don't know anyone to my knowledge. And so I had my dissertation sort of right there conceived. And so I've just been, since that time, really, I've just learned so much from it about my own life, about my own family. And it's been helpful for me in ministry as well. And so it's been a great ride, and I teach it. And I also, more than anything, just get to learn from people like you. And so I'm really grateful.
Well, let's talk about the Enneagram and spiritual formation. We've never covered this topic. I mean, we have, but indirectly, we've never had a very specific conversation. All right, let's just really, hunker down. So give me a 50,000 foot perspective on the Enneagram and spirituality. And then let's dive deeper into types in spirituality and particularly spiritual formation. Okay. Yeah. So the Enneagram is a spiritual formation tool. Let's start there.
So my phrase would be that the Enneagram is always a means and never an end. I think a lot of wounding and just cynicism comes out of the Enneagram when people treat it as an end. In other words, it's a parlor trick to shrink people down, to put people in a corner, all that stuff that I'm sure you've covered before. And so when we treat the Enneagram as a means, it is the beginning to understand not only your own life, but to get to name things. Like a phrase that's helpful for me is that we can't change what we won't name. And so once we name something, once we name wound, once we name areas of brokenness or areas of vices, a longing for virtue, character formation, we can then think about how the Enneagram helps us name things that are broken, longing, lacking in our lives, so that we can run toward the virtue side of that. And what's helpful is that people don't wake up. In my tradition, my background is the way of Jesus. People don't accidentally become like Jesus. It's always a radical intent. And it's not about earning, as Dallas Willard would say, it's about effort. And so spiritual practices can help us gain clarity and access into being a kind of person that looks more like Jesus through a virtuous life. But I think a lot of people think, well, if I, in my tradition, this is what someone might think subconsciously. If I go to church, if I give some money, maybe I join a small group, in 30 years, I'll wake up and be different. Most people, I feel like, just wake up after 30 years just feeling older. And it's because people like me, priests and pastors in the church, have not done a very good job resourcing the great Christian tradition to showcase all of these pathways of following Jesus that can really help us, based on our personality, become nuanced, become more virtuous, grow into the fruit of the Spirit that look more like Jesus in 30 years than we did before.
So how does, in your view, the Enneagram, and now, again, not all of the people who listen to our podcast would self-identify as Christians or coming from the Christian tradition, but let's stick there for just a moment. How do you see the Enneagram as a useful tool in spiritual formation?
Yeah, so let's think about it in two ways. It's not virtual reality. Virtual reality takes you into sort of another world. It's more like augmented reality. So what the Enneagram does is it gives you information on your lens. So if you put on a pair of glasses in augmented reality, it gives you access to more data than you had before. Why you show up the way you do, what's driving your motivations, why you continue to choose these patterns, et cetera, et cetera. So for me, that's been helpful to name. So the Enneagram is sort of that thing which named and read my journal, which, to use the words of Richard Rohr, it's the greatest cause of humiliation, is where you can typically source your Enneatype. And so for me, when I named as a type 3 that I struggle with a pretty fair amount of shame, a pretty fair amount of achievement orientation, performative sort of way of life, there were all sorts of like areas of life such as deceit, manipulation, fear of what others think about me. These have everything to do with longing for greater amounts of like patience in my life, self-control, longing for gentleness, because I can sort of become frustrated with people if they don't fit within the sort of paradigm of leadership that I'm looking to go into in the church I lead or the community I'm a part of. And so the Enneagram was helpful for me because it created this whole language, this whole universe of being able to name, that's the best way to talk about how I show up. And I didn't know that. It was in me. It was buried in my subconscious. But now that I'm aware of that, I can pair that more specifically with practices that are going to help me grow toward a certain virtue, because that's what I long for in life.
So if someone comes to you at a workshop, or maybe if you're a spiritual director, right? And they say to you, gee, I really want to use the Enneagram for purposes of spiritual transformation, to become, in your words, more of a mirror image of the person of Christ, right? How do you use it? Like, what would you say to someone who asks you the question, how do I use this system to bring about that kind of change?
Yeah, I think first of all, what's so helpful in identifying your Enneatype is it narrows down like a universe of motive possibilities and gives you just a few to sort of pay attention to. So like, for a 3, let's just take the vice of deceit. That was helpful for me to realize that so much of my strategies in life to get where I want to go involves me sort of being someone that I'm not, I'm not necessarily all the time, in order to achieve the outcome that I want to achieve in a particular environment. So I might say to that person, if you wrestle with that, think about the kind of person you want to be, right? So maybe that has to do with authenticity. Okay, great. So authenticity might be your virtue. If you know that your vice is deceit and authenticity is your virtue, then you have to become creative and to say, okay, what practice can I do on a regular basis that will train my neurons and train my habits in life, that I become more susceptible to veering a different way away from deceit and more toward authenticity. So for example, someone might say in the tradition I'm a part of, do you have a confessing life? Like, do you have someone, or is there an avenue that you regularly allow yourself to be authentic and to name things that often stay buried in you in order to just get it out and to acknowledge the fact that we have not always been authentic in all of these sort of ways, these relationships, these conversations. And that sort of practice is the beginning of cultivating virtue. Again, I think a lot of people hope virtue will just spontaneously happen to them over the course of life. And yet, I think that's why a lot of people feel disappointed in their spirituality. It's because it actually does take work in order to grow in these things. And so I would say the Enneagram is the beginning of naming things in order to understand how you can embrace certain practices and rhythms and habits in order to become the person that you long to be.
That's beautiful. We had a conversation earlier today with somebody, and I often talk about 12-step spirituality as a recovering, alcoholic and drug addict from years back. And I talk about the importance of the fourth and fifth step, very simply that we made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves in the fourth step. And then we admit to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs, which is the fifth step. And obviously I'm an Episcopalian, an Episcopal priest, and confession is, an important feature, at least in the Anglo-Catholic tradition, at the very least. And, I think it's sorely missed. And I do think, in fact, I think I even mentioned it in the road back to you, the importance of having a confessor, I'm pretty sure about that. And I think I might even mention it when I'm talking about threes. Certainly having a therapist at the very least, which is an entirely different dynamic.
And I think even like another degree of that, if even that's uncomfortable as a starting point, is at least begin with a journal where you can get that stuff out and begin to name things and go back and review the last 24 hours. How did you show up in certain conversations? Where were you hiding? Where were you inauthentic? Where did you lie? Where did you practice deceit in order to get what you want? And I think I'm always surprised. I think it takes effort not to move towards shame in that, but I'm always surprised, like just the mischief that I can cause in my own life and in my own relationships, and naming that as part of the healing process.
Hey, Anthony, we've been telling our listeners about KiwiCo for a while now, right?
Yes, we have.
Well, let me tell you something more. Did you know that they have subscription lines for kids of all ages, ranging from infants and preschoolers all the way to teens, and grown-ups are welcome to join in on the fun too.
Really? I didn't know this.
Yeah, their Eureka Crate and Maker Crate are designed for ages up to 100.
That's amazing.
With a KiwiCo subscription, kids and grown-ups can discover something new all year long. Through hands-on art and science projects, kids can discover the engineering and mechanics behind everyday objects, the science behind the chemistry of cooking, geography, new cultures, and brand new art and design techniques. These are real engineering, science, and art projects,
This
Anthony.
is amazing.
Right? And there's no commitment, so you can pause or cancel at any time. You know my assistant, Wendy, right? She got 2 kids, 8 and 10. They love their screen time, but they get so excited when they receive their new kit each month. The day the box arrives is now their favorite day of the month. They're hoping the next crate that arrives is the Cannonball launcher.
I love this.
So this year, everybody, redefine learning with play. Explore hands-on projects that build confidence, creativity, and critical thinking skills all year long. And check this out. Get 50% off your first month plus free shipping on any crate line with code Typology at KiwiCo.com. That's 50% off your first month at KiwiCo, KiwiCo.com, promo code Typology.
But I'm always surprised, like just the mischief that I can cause in my own life and in my own relationships, and naming that as part of the healing process.
And I like that you laughed as you said that a little bit, because I do think that humor, in addition to a tremendous amount of self-compassion as you do that work, is important. I frequently go to a Buddhist community here because I'm very much into mindfulness and I find that Buddhists really have this nailed. And of course, I also study the old Catholic tradition as well. So I have a, kind of a vocabulary around meditation that, but anyway, I've got this teacher, right? And even though I don't self-identify as a Buddhist, he's been tremendously helpful and gracious with me, about learning. And there's a lot of crossover and bleed over in between those traditions in that regard. And, he's really helped me to see how a regular practice of meditation gives me the ability, well, let me put it this way, the attention training that I get from practicing meditation gives me the capacity to step back and with a sense of humor and with self-compassion, observe my crazy thinking, right? To observe the machinations and all the gymnastics that my ego does from moment to moment on a daily basis. And just to kind of step back and go, and actually kind of giggle and go, oh, there you go again. And not shame myself, which is completely unhelpful. It's just as if to say, well, of course you're doing that. That's what the ego does. It's what it does. Now, and of course, that's not to resign and say, well, it's always going to be that way. It's just part of the journey of decoupling myself from the work of the ego can only be done when I can observe it regularly. And the only way I can do that regularly is by attention training so that I have that capacity to observe myself. And I think that's actually something the great Enneagram masters have always taught.
Yeah, I think stepping back and observing is such a huge part of that, and befriending parts of us that we would rather hide. I mean, to your point about mindfulness, they say that you have two amygdala, which you probably know, and they're like almond shapes in your brain, and they're small, but they contain about 12 million neurons apiece. And these are the fight-flight centers that we usually live from. And what they're finding is that it takes only about 30 hours of practicing silence and solitude, contemplative spirituality, or mindfulness to begin to see fruit in the area of being less reactive, less responding. And that doesn't mean we're being less active. It means we're being less reactive to life. And that's where so much mischief in my life comes from, is a reactive life that is sort of freighted with emotion and assumption. And so growing in that way of my life, where I'm more patient with my daughter, I'm a better husband because I'm more patient, I'm a better leader and pastor because I'm more patient. These are areas of life where I have found the practice of spirituality is so wedded to our growth personally. If we are going to become the telos, or the aim in which we sense that our journey is meant to be on, which takes effort.
Absolutely. All right, let's talk about this journey from vice to virtue a little bit. And if we can, and I know this is very difficult, very quickly, let's just move through the types. And you give me a spiritual practice if you can. And there may be bleed over, whatever. But on the journey, for example, of the one from anger to serenity, let's start there. As you are counseling people, teaching workshops, how do you help people engage in practices type by type that will help them make that journey?
Yeah. So I give people, first of all, I would say it's really good to freshen up your rhythms. So like if you like a certain rhythm, I think some people feel stuck after let's say 4 months, 6 months, or even a year or two into it. I think first of all, give yourself permission to realize there are so many practices available for us. And what are practices? In my tradition, practices are engaging the presence. And so what we're finding is I want contact with the divine. So that's all practices are. In of themselves, I think they're just sort of like tools in order to help us to be in the presence of the divine. And so one of the things I would say is that there are two ways that we should think about practices. The first is what I call downstream practices. The second are what I call upstream. So imagine this. Imagine you're on a lazy river. The downstream practices for you are going to be the practices for each type that are really natural and easy. There are certain practices that flow with your personality, and those are good. Those should be celebrated. Those should be continued in your life. There are other practices which are upstream. These are ones that you would probably avoid if you had the option. Nevertheless, there's good things in there for you because it's challenging your ego to swim upstream, and you have to fight for that virtue. You have to fight for that character. And so when it comes to, like, let's think about this in terms of triads. If you're familiar with the Enneagram for your listener, there are some that are more sort of cerebrally head-based when it comes to their practices. There are others that are more body or gut-based when it comes to their practices. So that would have to do with being in nature or hiking or justice or things of that nature. And then there are others of us that are more emotionally heart-centered in our practices, that we want to feel something, right? And so we should think about our practices, but not just think about the ones that we like, that we're good at, our downstream. We should also be thinking about our upstream at the same time. So I would say to find 2 practices that correspond with a kind of virtue that you long to grow in is really helpful when you think about each season of your life. So for the one, if you're struggling with anger and you long for more serenity, one of the things that I always tell ones to reflect on when it comes to the upstream is to journal. And the reason I say that is that you should focus, when you begin to journal, you not just focus on your imperfections, but you should start every single journal by beginning to name what's working in your life. Most ones are so preoccupied with what's dysfunctional, what's broken, what's not working. They never actually begin to name, wait a second, there's actually something working in my life right now. And I need to name that as a practice, because joy is cultivated through gratitude. And so when I can name things working in my life, that helps take the edge off of whatever anger that I'm sensing about this conversation, this relationship, this environment, and can help bring joy into all of life.
Great. Let's talk about twos.
So I'll just give, what I'll do is I'll give an upstream for each practice that I think could be helpful. The upstream, meaning this is the one that might be more challenging for each personality type. The 2, I might say, centering prayer. That's the idea of moving into just being with God, not having to solve anything or do anything. It's just sitting in the presence of the divine, allowing the divine to love you. And so it's not performative. What happens for 2s is that 2s have this sort of orientation that they work for love rather than working from love. Those are 2 different universes, because 2s want to work and serve for love. In other words, if I do this, perhaps you'll do this back to me, or I will get this in return. But when 2s can learn to serve, or to actually be in a certain place, they can learn to love and serve from love. And so I'm really pretty convicted to always remind 2s that you're loved for who you are, not what you do. And it's a really beautiful thing for you to sit in the presence of the divine, so that you know who you are, so that you can serve out of clarity from that place, and that you also have the freedom to say no when you're not called to it. So centering prayer is one. I would recommend Father Thomas Keating's book, Open Heart, Open Mind, which would be a great place to start if that's something that you are needing to grow in, because 2s really struggle to just sit and be. They value doing over being.
Yeah. And there's that, it's a good book, Cynthia Bourgeau's book on centering prayer. There's also Martin Laird's book, Into the Silent Land, which is, fantastic. I think, a seminal work that just about anyone who's interested in meditation, or actually contemplation from his perspective, not meditation, though they have a lot of similarities in outcomes, is another book that, because, we get a lot of pushback from some people in the Christian tradition who don't realize that meditation and contemplation are very rooted in what we do. It's just that, like right around the Reformation, a lot of this stuff got thrown out, sort of, if it's not in the Bible, you know what I mean? It's like, so anyhow, those 2 books would be great resources for people.
Well, what's interesting is that it is in the Bible. That's the thing that I find so hilarious is, like, in my latest book, Being with God, there's a whole section of one of the chapters in the middle where I show constantly Jesus is leaving the crowds, going out into the desert, and just sitting in the presence of God. We can't honestly believe that Jesus for 40 days in the wilderness was just talking at God. We have to believe that so much of that time was around stillness and solitude and silence, and knowing who he was in the Father, and then moving into operating back into ministry from that space. So I think we see it everywhere in the New Testament, particularly the Gospels.
Yes. The problem is that, for me anyway, that in the Christian tradition, we've become such a belief-based rather than a practice-based religion. It's no wonder to me that so many people are migrating to Buddhism. Buddhism is a practice-based, system, versus Christianity, which is really much more of a belief-based system.
Yeah.
And I would imagine you probably agree with that based on, the content of our conversation so far.
It's why I think a lot of what I'm seeing, a lot of patterns. So speaking from my frame of reference, I'm seeing a lot of followers of Jesus much more interested in recovering the Hebrew way of his rabbi-ness. Mm-hmm. In other words, that Jesus would say things like, hey, follow me. Don't just believe things about me, really get up and get your hands dirty and walk behind me and watch what I do. And I think we're seeing a big movement away from the sort of Greek understanding of, primarily it being idea-based, theoretical abstraction, and things moving more toward a Hebrew way of following a Jewish Lord who says, follow me, who says, get your hands dirty, who would pray the Shema 3 times a day, which has everything to do with loving our neighbor. So these types of things are very earthy, very practical. And so I agree with what you're sensing, and that I think people are longing for that kind of spiritual based life.
All right, let's move to 3s.
The 3s, I won't belabor that just because I am a 3. I tend to over talk about the 3. I already have talked about it a little bit. I would say for 3s, you're upstream because we often hide from authenticity, and it's a strategy in order to protect our image in the world and to sort of project the kind of persona we want. I will double down and say confession with a loved one, confession with a pastor or priest, confession with a community group, someone you trust is really important. At least confess to a journal as your starting place, because if not, you will tend to hide throughout the majority of your life. And there will just be many things that long to be formed in you that never are, because of the amount of hiding and energy that you take to do that.
Antonio.
Iano.
Sticking to a workout routine can get boring when you do the same thing over and over again, right?
Yeah, I totally get that. It's so much easier to stick to your goals when you keep your workouts interesting.
That's right. For me, I like to stick with a routine as it relates to what time of day I work out. But to stay motivated, Anthony, I like changing up the exercises I do throughout the week. And that's why I love Peloton. They have so many new and exciting classes to explore on the Peloton app. There's a workout for every goal, day, and mood, so I can de-stress from a long day with 30 minutes of strength and 20 minutes of cardio. Or if I know I've got a lot of interviews, I can do a quick 15-minute total body class when I get up in the morning to give me energy for the day.
Oh, that sounds great.
And I do yoga, right?
I do.
Well, I love the variety I get with their instructors, and I always finish refreshed. Like last month, I told you about their new artist series music selections, where you can choose the music of a single artist for an entire class.
I thought that was the coolest thing.
Well, this month, I'm looking forward to trying their new boxing classes.
Where can I check out all these classes?
All you got to do is visit onepeloton.com to learn more. That's onepeloton.com.
I go back to this 4th and 5th step because I've just done it with my sponsor. And, it's pages and pages and pages of material. And, just first of all, the exercise of writing down. And I would not just call them defects of character, because there's a part of that is a little off-putting to me, but really they're defenses of character. They're character defenses. More, this is the strategy that I unconsciously came up with as a little person to find my way in the world, to protect myself, to cope, to navigate relationships. In my worst sense, it is this, kind of my ego strategy for getting other people to organize their priorities around mine, right? And so, however we want to frame it, just that journey of self-reflection followed by an excruciatingly honest sharing of one's with a trusted other, very important, with a trusted other that is doing similar work, so they know what it is that you're doing. I remember when I was being taught how to be a confessor, and in my tradition, you sit here and the person you're with actually sits next to you facing the other direction. And so that they're basically just speaking into your ear. And they would talk, and then they would start sharing. I always say, okay, start with the hard one first, and let's work our way down. You know what I mean? And then at the end, the priest always says, "Is there something more?" And then they come up with something, and then there's a pause, and you go, "Is there something more?" And you literally do that several times before you give the absolution, right? The prayer of absolution. And it's quite beautiful, and it's full of sweat and rashes, and whatnot.
Yeah.
But of course, the outcome is this freedom, this knowledge of that it's okay to be in our humanness, our creatureliness,
Let me ask you about that. I'm interested in that posture. Is it because that confessor is a vessel and not the sort of, are they simply a vessel for a sense of acceptance and forgiveness? Or why wouldn't you look at them? Why would you look beyond them? That's my question.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons. One is very practical, I think, which is when looking directly at somebody, it can become very, very difficult for the other to really share what's going on. And for the, not that I've ever looked shocked, because I'm a 4 on the Enneagram, and empathy, and like, you could tell me anything and I go, I don't have a lot of judgment, right? But I think the person in that moment of confession can be looking for cues, like what is the response here? And so I do think there's some benefit in sitting beside and speaking toward the confessor without looking into the eyes of the confessor. Now, when I do the absolution, I'm always looking.
Yeah.
Always looking.
I see.
And I look together with them. Anyhow, so all right, let's move on to those beautiful 4s.
Let's talk about 4s in a couple ways. So because it's you, Ian, I would say the downstream for you that's going to come easily is probably actually journaling or some method of getting out gushing emotions. This is what's happening in my life. I always encourage 4s that because that typically comes easy for you to understand your emotions and be able to articulate those, or at least understand them at some level. It's good to start with actually interceding or blessing other people in whatever journal or mechanism that is, because often 4s can move toward a preoccupation with their own emotion as if that's the only thing happening in the world. And so I'm often really quick to tell 4s, hey, start with actually celebrating, or at least like longing or lamenting with someone else before you get to your own stuff. So that's one of the things I would say in the way of journaling. Don't just get sort of tunnel vision about your own life. The upstream, I would say, is always move toward feasting. Feasting is such a good practice for 4s. Always be the one to show up with the bottle of champagne at someone else's graduation. Always be the one to show up with the most lavish dish at some sort of festival or some sort of way in which we're acknowledging a birthday or something like that. Because once again, it gets you out of yourself. It moves you into celebration. And one of the things I do for my tradition is I try to pair each type with spiritual practices with a time of the sort of what's called the liturgical year, or the church calendar is what they would call it. And so like for the 4, I'm like, never miss Easter, because Easter is that reminder that no matter how dark your inner world may feel at times, joy always comes in the morning, and there will be a day where light will remain forever. And so that's what I would acknowledge for the 4.
Which can be very hard. I think back on times in my life, I often like to say that 4s, well, in many ways, all of our passions or our vices are addictions. They very much have a compulsive kind of quality to them, right? And so for me, at different times in my life, I'd say that one of my primary addictions was suffering. Who would I be without my suffering, without my story of pain, right? And wouldn't I become kind of boring and weird if everything was like a 7 running around, just bringing the champagne, and you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so 2 things strike me. I think 2 other practices for 4s that are so helpful. One is what I call sympathetic joy, and this is a Buddhist idea, which is that rather than envy coming up when I see someone else having that, who has something I want, it could be material, it could be a character trait, it could be who knows what, right? How can I have sympathetic joy to actually not see their success as my failure? How do I see that individual and actually celebrate that which I would normally envy in them? I celebrate, right?
Yeah.
And here's the kicker. With sympathetic joy in that Tibetan Buddhist tradition, you have to be able to practice it with your enemies. So that when your enemy experiences success, you must celebrate it with them too.
That's the hard stuff right there. Mm-hmm. That is it. And as a 3-wing force, so like competition, comparison, control, those can become like 3 guiding C's for me. Do you remember? So I grew up in the Nintendo era, and there were some games where you could create your character. And so let's say you had 10 points. You could give 3 of those points to like strength, 5 of those points to endurance, which left you with 2 points maybe for, height. And that's often how I used to see others, and how I still am tempted to see others, is like, if it's almost like there's a limited amount of success that can happen in the world. Mm-hmm. And so if I'm not getting it, then they're getting what's remained over, and there's not enough for everybody. And I often view that as a sort of framework that if they have a win, then that must ultimately mean that I'm a loss. Or if they have a success, that must mean that I'm a failure. So why social media is crippling, all of these comparative tools that we now have that just reinforce our own brokenness if we're not careful. So I completely resonate with what you're saying.
Can I say something? There's a great expression. There's a book that Rabbi Daniel Lapin, and he talks about the Jewish mindset. And he says, if you have 10 friends and one of them succeeds, it puts you that much closer to success yourself. If you have 2, 3, 4, and 5, your odds increase. They continue to increase. And he said that's just part of the mindset. So your win is ultimately my win. I just love that perspective. That's a great way to think about it for a 3 and a 4.
I think there's one other, and we actually close with a kind of, I don't know if it's a blessing or not, but at the end of every typology episode. But where I got it from is a meditation practice. And what it is in your mind's eye, you imagine, let's say, AJ, I would imagine you for a moment. And I might spend 5 minutes in my meditation time, eyes closed, attention really fixed on this set of declarations or blessings. I see you in my mind, and I say, may you have love, may you have joy, may you have peace, may you have healing, may you have rest. And I just keep saying it. It's almost like the Jesus prayer or something. But what I'm doing, I'm not saying, Jesus, please give AJ, love, joy, peace, healing, and rest. It's like, no, it's coming from me. God will figure out the blessing, right? I don't even get involved in that. That's above my pay grade. But literally what I'm doing in that moment is, rather than getting sort of all fixed up in my need for love, joy, peace, healing, and rest, it's like, just as you were saying, to bless the other in the moment. And that's transformative for me in some very powerful ways. I don't have time to go into it, but I will say this. I actually can become very theoretical. So it must be a very strong 5 influence in my life. I love ideas. And so for me, and even in meditation, I actually do not get hung up in feelings at all. Really. I don't have all this wave of feelings that have come up during meditation. It's actually a fairly neutral space for me. And I have to be careful more thinking about the theories and the ideas around meditation. They have to be quieted, but not feelings. It's fascinating. Everybody's different, I guess. Okay, moving on to 5s.
5s, and just to put a period on just so much richness that you just said, Ian, with Anthony. If you struggle to bless your enemy, the more you do it, the more you'll believe it. That's what's happened for me. Like there are people in my life that I've been wounded by. And there's another level of that. If there's, deep trauma and abuse, things like that, that's a different category.
Sure.
But there are people just like throughout the course of my day or my year that have just like offended me or et cetera, et cetera. And it's like all I can do to bless them. And I find that there's a transformative thing that happens to me as I learn to mean it. But it's the meaning it that takes time for me to get there. And the only way that happens is through effort and repetition of me continuing to do it.
Yes. So here's something, this is something I tell priests all the time and pastors. Look, people come to us all the time and they say, how do I forgive somebody? And what do we usually say? Pray about it. Or, it's often what they say, or pray about it. Or they might say, eventually they'll get frustrated with the question. I go, let me give you the name of a therapist. And I'm, you know what I'm saying? And I'm always like, really? Like they pay you for that? So here's the deal. That practice I just described in the Buddhist tradition is called metta. And so you start with visualizing yourself, saying, may you have love, may you have joy, may you have peace, may you have healing, may you have rest, may you have a sense of ease, right? Whatever. Then the next, you would move on then after 5 minutes to thinking of someone you deeply love. And you do it for that person, which will generate probably feelings of warmth and care, right, in your person. Then you move on to someone who you have a neutral relationship with. It could be the woman behind the counter at CVS, somebody that you don't, it's just like a neutral relationship. Then the next person you move on to is to somebody who has deeply wounded you. And by then, of course, you've generated some warmth, and then you do it for 5 minutes with them. Here's my experience, because I've done it in some profound ways. There have been people I've struggled for years to forgive. For years, I could not let go of the emotional charge. Every time I thought of them, cortisol would run through my body. My heart would start to race. Like, I hate that. You know what I'm going to say. So now, if I do that for 3 or 4 weeks, just practicing that in meditation, 15, 20 minutes at a pop, thinking about that person, blessing them, within 3 weeks or so, 2 weeks, the charge is gone. And I really have this genuine, actually felt experience of forgiveness.
Yeah.
A felt experience of it, not just an intellectual one, but I feel it in my body. And it's like, why didn't anyone ever tell me that?
Well, maybe the Jesus tradition, this is why he said, forgive 70 times 7. Maybe that's for the same thing that happened. Wow. That's not for like 490 different things that just like ticked you off. It's for the same relationship that's dysfunctional, the same thing that happened. You're going to have to come back to that 70 times 7. It's an invitation to say, keep going, don't give up, keep pushing in. And I think that's like an incredible invitation for Jesus to normalize the fact that we hold wounds, we hold grudges, and then we begin to get cavernous in of ourselves, and joy is lost, and all this rage and stuff that God wants for us begins to get stuffed in us, and we get stuck in those patterns. And so I think that could be helpful for that came out of Jesus. That was really helpful for me.
I love that correlation.
So good.
Just to finish that out, I have a picture. My father was a drug addict and alcoholic and died from it at 63. And you can imagine growing up with that, there was a lot of trauma. There were a lot of wounds. There was a lot of suffering. And I found a picture of my dad when he was 5, and he's sitting cross-legged on a lawn, looking directly at the camera. I have that photo in where I meditate, and sometimes I just put it up in front of me and I do that prayer practice I just described. And I just do, may you have love, may you have joy, may you have peace, may you have healing, may you have rest. And I direct it right toward him in my mind's eye. And I have to tell you that in my own experience, it took me, I don't know, dude, I went to so many therapists trying to figure out how to forgive this guy. And it wasn't until I actually used that practice that I had a moment where I found just spontaneously that I was warmed and gentle toward him. I could actually get a little emotional about that right now. That I had spent so many years and so much money trying to figure out how to do this, and such a little simple prayer practice actually changed my heart.
Yeah. And yet it was effortful. It didn't just happen.
Yes, it did. Right. And
awesome.
And then I started to wonder, how come I never had a pastor who could give me a practice like that?
Yeah, that's right.
And I'm not, finger wagging at all these pastors. They just don't know, right? They just don't know.
Hey everybody, one of the lessons I've learned over the years is that not everybody benefits from a traditional 50-minute counseling session. And this is why some people can go to couples therapy or personal counseling for a long time and never really get anywhere. This is why I'm such a believer of intensive counseling and my friends at Restoring the Soul in Colorado, created by my longtime friend Michael Cusick to help couples or individuals experience deep change in half-day blocks over 1 or 2 weeks.
Now listen, if you can't wait months or years to get to the bottom of an issue or to experience breakthrough, you need to get in touch with my friend Michael and his extraordinary team of counselors at Restoring the Soul. If you're looking to get out of the rut you're in, but can't wait months or years, call Restoring the Soul today for a free consultation with Michael's staff. Call 303-932-9777 and learn how their intensive counseling process can help you. As a special bonus, just for Typology listeners, make sure to visit www.restoringthesoul.com/typology to download their PDF called 5 Ways Unaddressed Trauma May Be Derailing Your Relationships.
All right, moving on to 5s. I want to get through all these.
5s, again, I am a Shema. I love the Hebrew scriptures. So integration is really important. So for anyone, no matter what your type is, if you're a human, integration of spirituality, and that's why triads really matter. So 5s are really that head triad. I find 5s, I'm married to one, she's amazing. She solves all the problems of the world. She understands things from a meta level. She also has a particularly intense strategy to stay uninvolved in drama. She doesn't want to get her hands dirty. She has the answers to all of my problems in her head, but when it comes to getting involved in that conversation or in that community or whatever, she kind of desires to stay at a distance. So I would say for 5s, the ones I've experienced at least, it's really important for you to think about your spirituality as not just ideas in your head, but it really is important for you to know what you feel and to also use your body in some way, shape, and form to be involved, to be willing to get your hands dirty, to be willing to show up certain places, even when it's inconvenient for your timetable or something like that. I find that a really great principle to live with is that love begins where convenience ends. And for both 3s and 5s, convenience can become really important. So love actually only starts when we get to the end of our convenience and we begin to become inconvenient for the sake of another. And so for 5s to realize that life is messy, life is dirty, and for you to sort of get outside your head and to be involved in that in some sort of practice is really helpful. That can be the soup kitchen. That can be the church group. That can be the neighborhood thing. Whatever that is, it's just a matter of being involved, being included in something where you're known, you're felt, and your presence is wanted.
Yeah, to move from observation to participation.
Yes, that's
right.
it. That's it.
In the life of the 5. Great. Let's move on to 6s.
6s, and this is going to sound a little churchy, so excuse me for listeners that may not identify with this. Whatever your sort of learning book or your sort of learning theory would be, for the 6s in the church tradition, I would say scripture memory is really important because fear is really something that continually grips the 6 to talk themselves out of all sorts of good ideas. And so I find that like having those scripts, I mean, the root word of scripture is script. In other words, what the scripture is trying to do is in-story us. It's not just trying to be a history lesson or whatever. It's trying to actually give us a story to live into that's bigger than our individualism. And so we need scripts that we come back to over and over again in life that sort of live in our muscle memory, that live in our neurology, that when those moments come where I just want to run or I want to stop or I'm fearful, it's having those scripts that reinforce that my vision, my dream, my conviction, it wasn't just a result of last night's burrito and now I've moved on. It actually was something I need to move into. And so I need to rehearse and remember my script. So whether it's a Bible passage or whether it's whatever that might be for your tradition, have that wired into your neurology so that you're not just making decisions based on how well or not well things are going in your life. So scripture memory in the Christian tradition is really important. And we've really gotten away from it in the last few decades.
And so that is that, right? The journey from the vice of fear to the virtue of faith, right?
Yeah. Trust.
Fantastic. Okay. Moving to 7s.
Yeah. 7s, which I find that most all of us love talking about the most for one reason or another. 7s, it's so obvious. It's very Lenten. It's also woven into Advent in the Christian tradition. It's having a vision for solitude and silence at least once a day. I find that in that place, you are confronted with how things are going, what you feel. It gets you out of a future orientation of always planning to sort of evade my emotions or my past. And so have a time where you are reflecting. I find that if you can reflect in nature, If you're someone like me where there's continuous partial attention, as Linda Stone would say, we're like, oh, squirrels, we're always sort of veering when we just sit and try to be still. And that's really hard to do. Get on a trail and just allow yourself to be without a phone, without a podcast, allowing yourself just to be in creation and letting your thoughts just go and rehearsing, why is that happening? What do I believe about that? What do I make up about that? What conversation do I need to face and not run from? So that sort of practice of solitude and silence is really important for the 7 every day.
Again, moving then from the vice of gluttony to sobriety would be what maybe the upstream practice would help those folks do. 8s on the Enneagram, challengers.
8s. Yeah, I think 8s are often unaware of how they're perceived. They need accountability. So if you lead a thing, or if whatever you're doing, I think you need to appoint someone because again, you're a powerful person typically. So people often won't approach you for one reason or another. So just giving someone, like literally giving someone, hey, I give you permission to, on some sort of rhythmic basis, to tell me how I'm showing up and how others perceive me. So it's that sense of being able to face that, which you'd rather ignore or just assume the best about, and to say, hey, listen, I trust you. No matter what you say, you're not going to be penalized for it. I need accountability. Would you bring that to my life? That's a hard practice. Nobody wants to face that. When we begin to face those things, it's so helpful. I would rather know that there's mustard on my chin than live my life with it sitting there. And yet so much of my leadership as a 3, it's similar. I just assume the best. I hope for the best. And yet there are trusted people around me that I need to say, hey, give me some feedback because I'm going to need it.
Yeah. I like to say that with 8s, I like to tell 8s, I ask them, do you have someone in your life who can tell you no?
Yes.
And I think to your point that's a really, really important thing to have in the life of an 8. We all need it, but it's particularly true with 8s, who often don't have that person in their life. Same thing for 7s, by the way. Do you have someone who can tell you no? All right, last one, 9s. This is so rich.
Yeah, so 9s are often going in, all sorts of, they're pulled in so many directions. They're the people that we want to be allies and to pull them. They often don't even understand their own sort of priorities, things of that nature. Well, as it turns out, almost every, or I should say the ones I've studied, most spiritual traditions have a sort of habitual vision for your day. So like in the Jewish world, it's the fixed hour prayer, the three prayers a day, right? In the ancient Christian tradition, it's the fixed hour prayer. What's happening is we are pulled into so many cultural scripts throughout our day that we lose priority about who we are in our unified meta story. And so what I find for the 9 is have times in your day, and this is easy with phones now because you can set an alarm. There's so many good apps. When you get up, maybe at lunch and before bed or whatever would work for you, have times in your day where you just pause for 30 seconds and you can reclaim your identity so that you're not being pulled always in so many directions, and that you have a voice to assert what it is that you're called to and what you need to say yes and no to. So I used to pastor a church in Grand Rapids called Mars Hill Bible Church. And we had a pretty large staff, and I would have whoever was working the front desk 3 times a day at 9, at noon, and at 3 come through all of our offices with a bell. And that person would just ring a bell, and no matter what meeting we were in, what whiteboard session we were doing, what was happening, a bell would go off, and it was really a pleasing bell, not like a school bell where you're changing classrooms. And we would stop whatever we were doing for 30 seconds. We would be still. We would say the Jesus prayer, which is just, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me. And then we go back to our meeting. And it was that reminder, wait, the divine is here. We're not alone. And whatever problem, whatever conversation, whatever thing we're facing right now, God is here. And it was so invitational for us just to get off of ourselves and to reprioritize who we are. And so I would say for the 9s, find that in your own rhythm where you can recenter around your identity and who God says you are.
Right. The whole process of differentiation and of individuation for that 9 is so important. And I like the bell idea because it reminds the 9 to wake up. Right. It's like we associate bells. I mean, that's what the church bells were designed to do, to remind people to wake up. It was also for the 9 to spiritually wake up.
Yes,
right?
That's right. That's right.
To come out of the trance of their type, right, into an awareness of their own actual being, their own beingness, right? Because as we know, 9s can if they're not careful, they can become selfless, no self.
Yes.
And so if they have some practice like a bell like that, fantastic, to come back to the reclaiming of personal authority and self is so important. So one observation I have about all of this, and I don't know if you know, I just dropped a book last week called The Story of You. And the subtitle is An Enneagram Journey to Discovering Your True Self. And one of the principles in the book that I draw on is the Saint Ignatius of Loyola's a Jerry Contra, which I know you know, which is literally meaning to act against. And that's what you're talking about here with all of these practices. Act against that which is your normal strategy, your normal pattern, right? In order to neutralize it, if you will, because these patterns are there to make us feel safe, to cope with our insecurities, right? Our doubts. And I love what you're saying, because this Jerry Contra thing is a way of moving against the grain of those habitual patterns.
Yes.
So that it's like again, to break out of the trance of your type, and it's your ego's machinations, if you will.
Yeah, it's honest self-confrontation.
Mm-hmm.
It's willing to confront yourself, but it's important to, we talked about shame earlier. It's important to know that grace is here, that love and forgiveness is available, and that like we can change and we can grow. And it's a really beautiful thing for ourselves, for our neighbors, for our world. And I find the most hopeful thing today in a world where it just seems like there's so much conflict is that change and growth is possible. And if we do good self-work, if we have more people around us committed to that, then I think our communities will become more beautiful as a result.
Mm. Well, that's a great place to end. Mm-hmm. That was such a rich conversation, man. We're going to have you back on.
Awesome.
And talk some more, because I just sense there's so much richness that we could grab out of you and share with people. But I love that we walked through all those types and spoke about these upstream practices and how can they move from their vice to their virtue, right? Their passion to their virtue. Because I do think that people are like, okay, great, I know the Enneagram. Now what the hell do I do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like, I know about my type, but now what the hell do I do?
Yeah.
For me, one of the things that's been so interesting, and I'd love to talk with you about this at a later point, maybe offline, is the integration of narrative therapy in the Enneagram has been really helpful to me. And that's what the story of you is about in a lot of ways, which is these are broken stories. Each type represents a broken story. And the unconscious motivation of each of those types is actually in direct opposition to the larger story of God. It is in direct opposition to the story of grace. And you could go through all 9 of them and show like, oh, this really is this is a broken story that helped me in childhood, but in the afternoon of life versus the morning, in the afternoon of life, this broken story needs rewriting.
Yes. Yes.
Right. And so maybe we can get together at some point, and I should just send you, maybe after this, you give me your address. I'll send you a new copy of the book.
I'd love that. Ian, did you study A.H. Almas's work on holdings in the Enneagram?
No, I know Almas's work, but I have not. No.
He's got this thing called holdings, which no one ever does anything with that I've read about. I think they're brilliant. And they basically talk about, it's sort of like, the Atlas sort of God of holding the weight of the world. What happens is that we understand ourselves and our world is broken. So we overcompensate into certain directions in order to try to fix it, if you will. Mm-hmm. This is where I feel like a lot of narrative therapy comes in. I'll give you an example. So like type 1 is so obvious, like in a broken world, I will learn to hold the world together through self-improvement, right? And that just exponentially increases the weight that people carry, which is where anger comes from, rage and all that stuff. Like a 2 would say in a broken world, I am going to serve in order to get others to accept me. So these strategies that we have in response to our trauma, our pain, our past, in order to try to put the world back together. And they're sort of good, but they're also really heavy and not ultimately helpful, and cause all sorts of mischief, I think, over the course of time. But anyway, no one talks about Almas, and I feel like his stuff on holdings speaks into what you're saying and some of the work you've probably done around that.
Yeah, because I think one of the things that has helped me about thinking of the Enneagram narratively. So it's so interesting to me. Like, I remember when I first started studying the Enneagram and then writing about it, I kept thinking as a therapist, gosh, I don't know if these are personality types. I kind of struggled with the term, and I see them as personality types, right? But personality is a very complicated subject.
Yes.
Personality theory, personality development, disposition, temperament versus learned. I mean, it's just so complicated, so contested within psychology. And I kept reading them going, okay, they're personality types, okay, whatever. But what it really dawned on me early on was like, yeah, but really they're stories. Yeah. These are stories that people inhabit. Yeah. And we become the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and how the world works.
Sure.
And that's personality theory. Like your personality is built on a story, right? And so for me, when I'm able to sit with people and I ask them, what if the story you tell yourself about who you are and how the world works isn't true?
Yeah.
Right. And then they go, because the moment you start talking about narrative, people pay attention, because we all understand our lives as a story. Right. Yeah. And then you say to them, well, what would you do if I said that you have agency to change the story? Yeah. Like, that story helped you survive as a little kid.
Yeah.
So thank it.
Yeah.
Right. But if you find yourself in the wrong story, leave.
Yeah, that's right. So did you see today or yesterday, there's a film that George Clooney directed, just dropped, called The Tender Bar?
I know of, I've heard of it. Yes.
It's based off a memoir. It is that in essence, what you are saying is, I just watched this film today because today's ostensibly my day off. It was that. It was what story are you telling yourself?
Wow.
And the story you tell yourself is the story you can actually live into. What story do you want to live into?
Yes.
And it was brilliant. So I would commend that to you to watch that as soon as possible. It was fantastic.
Oh, I love to hear that. And I love to hear that maybe the book is well timed.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Write it.
Who knows?
That's good.
All right.
I can't wait to read it, man.
AJ, tell everybody where they can find you, your website, and your socials and all the stuff people ask about at the end of podcasts.
Yeah, ajsherrill.org. That's 2 R's, 2 L's. It's a confusing last name. I'm sorry about that. You can find me on all social media, or at least one's not called TikTok and others like that, but Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. It's just my name. So would love to engage.
All right, everybody, that's AJ Sherrill, AJSHERRILL. And he is the author of Being with God, The Absurdity, Necessity, and Neurology of Contemplative Prayer. Is that what it is? I think something to that effect. And then the Enneagram for Spiritual Formation. I commend both of those books to you. Go grab them. And what a rich conversation, AJ. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Typology guests, may you have love, may you have joy, may you have peace, may you have healing, and may you have rest. Until next time.